Hi everyone. So this is going to be a short lecture on organizational economics. Um, we sort of started our journey in approximately the Industrial Revolution. So 1880s, 1890s, 1900s or so in the U.S. with classical organization theory. We then moved sort of into the 40s and 50s, and um, what we're really seeing at this point by the 70s, the 80s, even in the 60s, but especially in the 70s and 80s, we're really seeing sort of a transformation in markets and in products and certainly in technology and things like that. So around this time, uh, people or organizations shift from making things, from manufacturing things, um, to financialization, to technology, to services, and things like that. Also, around this time, there's obviously an incredible growth of technology, but there's sort of this rapid globalization of markets and economies as well. So where we start seeing things like offshoring, offshoring of jobs, things like that. We see sort of global organizations kind of emerge. Um, and then we also see sort of a rapid increase in this idea of financialization, and Mimi Abramovitz mentioned that in the podcast from a couple of weeks ago. But that's essentially making money off of money. It's devising, marketing, and selling sort of financial products. So that has to do with banks and investment houses, capital, that kind of thing, stock trading, so on and so forth. Of course, the other thing we see grow pretty rapidly during this time is healthcare, and social work um, is sort of part of that growth process. Um, so up until this point, economics have traditionally focused on markets. And markets are simply the place where goods and services are bought and sold. So they haven't focused so much on the makers of, or the people who are providing those goods and services. And so um, economics was very much concerned with things like supply, demand, price, discounting, so on and so forth. And that's all good and well, but um, the issue arises that certain commodities, certain products, especially financial products, healthcare products, healthcare services, some technology products, so on and so forth, are not suited to that sort of traditional economic thinking. Let me give you an example. Take healthcare, for example. Healthcare companies don't, or hospitals, I should say, even some doctors' offices don't sort of readily make available a price list. So imagine you're going to go buy a loaf of bread, right? You could go to one store, you could examine the price, maybe the size, the weight, the freshness, so on and so forth. And if you didn't like that particular loaf of bread, you could put it back, drive down the road to the next store, and pick up another piece of bread, right, or another loaf of bread, and if that one maybe is a little bit fresher, or it's a little bit bigger, it's made out of a different flour or something like that, and maybe the price is a little better. If you like it, you buy it, right? This is sort of how products compete for customers over price and quality and things like that. If you break your arm, if a person breaks his or her arm, they don't sort of go to the hospital and say, well, how much do you charge for X-rays and setting a broken arm? And if you don't like that price, well, you just drive down the road to the next hospital. People don't do that. And the first reason is because some encounters with hospitals come during times of emergency. So the last thing that people are thinking about is sort of how much this is going to cost. They're often thinking about, how do I care for my loved one or myself or something like that. But add to this the idea that insurances often negotiate specific prices for particular services. So two different people with the exact same going into a hospital for the exact same medical procedure might pay two different prices, given that they have two different health insurances, two different kinds of health insurance, even. And then, so price is sort of this weird concept when when it comes to things like healthcare. And then consider, for example, that it's very difficult to predict demand. It's difficult to predict how many people are going to come in for, say, a broken arm or a hernia operation or something like that. There are ways to do it, and that's usually predict how many occurrences will happen based on the size of a population, but it's very difficult to do. And then, of course, it's very difficult to build up a supply of healthcare if demand all of a sudden does increase. And that was actually one of the problems that people are worried about with sort of COVID-19, is that COVID-19 would lead to sort of a rapid increase in hospitalizations and a need for ventilators. And of course, it would if that happened over the course of a couple of days or even a couple of weeks, it would be nearly impossible to sort of have enough hospital beds, ventilators, staff to care for people in that short amount of time. So there's sort of, when it comes to healthcare, there's sort of often sort of a set supply, and very difficult to build up supply if that demand does increase. So higher education is another sort of complex product that's sort of a good example of something that's not really suited to traditional, rules of supply and demand. So, take, for example, higher education. Does a person want the experience of going away to college, or do they need to stay home, to care for a family member, to work, or something like that? Is a person interested in small class sizes, or are they unconcerned about that and they're fine with large class sizes? And then consider this last question, is higher education more about transitioning from one phase of life to the next, say from young person to adult, or is it about learning kind of a set of skills? All of this sort of leads to how much people are willing to pay for higher education. Some people are willing to pay quite a bit for higher education. Some people are much more conservative when it comes to that kind of thing. But needless to say, higher education doesn't or sort of follows some of the same rules of supply and demand that healthcare does. There's often sort of a set supply, and it's very difficult to build that supply up should demand increase. Of course, demand for higher education is much more stable from year to year, at any rate, that's what makes sort of thinking about these products and services much more complex. So in steps organizational economics, sort of in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and things like that. And the big idea here is that a lot of products that are emerging at that time, technology services, healthcare, higher education, financial products, and so on and so forth, because they don't follow the rules of traditional markets, that is to say, supply and demand, it's no longer possible to study the markets. What we have to shift from now is studying markets to studying organizations that produce these kinds of modern products. So here's a couple of the key ideas in organizational economics. Organizations exist because they can take advantage of economies of scale. We'll talk about that here in a second. In a lot of the organizational economics literature, including the paper that we'll read for this week, they use the term firm, and that's simply just a substitute for an organization, but they use firm. So despite the fact that organizations can take advantage of economies of scale, organizations still incur costs related to doing business. And we can talk about sort of what some of these costs are here in a second. So as a result of this, the primary focus of the organizations is to reduce its costs. And the organizational economists call these things transaction costs. So essentially the way to make more money for these organizations is to reduce the cost of producing the good, and to sort of look at all of the different kinds of costs that are embedded in producing a good. So let's talk about economies of scale real quick, and let me just I'll just put myself up here. So the definition of an economy of scale is a proportional savings in costs gained by an increased level of production. Essentially, what we're saying here is that if you make one of something, all of the costs related to setting up a factory and labor and technology and research and development and stuff like that is contained has to be contained in the price of that one unit. But if you make two, all of a sudden you can spread those costs over 2 units. If you make 3, you can spread those costs over 3 units, 4, so on and so forth, right? So let me give you an example here. So to print one copy of a newspaper would be extraordinarily expensive. It would be so expensive that no one would buy it, and then of course it would be outdated and so sort of useless after a day or so. So the cost of the printing press, the reporters, the paper, the ink, the electricity, the building rent, so on and so forth, the layout people, the photographers, think about all the jobs that sort of go into producing a newspaper. Excuse me. If you printed one copy, all of those costs would have to be reflected in the price of that one newspaper. Okay. So, like I said, it would be so expensive that no one would buy it, and then the paper would be outdated after a day or so anyway. But what if these costs could be spread over 10,000 or 50,000 or even 100,000 newspapers? All of a sudden, the cost of a unit, a single newspaper, would go down, which is good for consumers, and profit would go up, which is good for the organization. So that is, in a sense, is an economies of scale. We can think about the same thing for something like healthcare, right? So imagine setting up a surgery center to do one surgery, not even a series of one of the different kind of, or a series of the same kind of surgery, but one surgery, right? So you'd need to train the provider, which of course would take years. You'd need to construct the space and build it in a special way, pay the rent, utilities, products, sort of whatever materials are needed to sort of do a surgery. It would be so expensive that no one could afford it. And of course it would take so long to do that it wouldn't be responsive to that person's healthcare needs. But if that cost could be spread out over 1,000 procedures or 10,000 procedures, same thing happens. The cost of the procedure goes down, which of course is good for the consumer, and the amount of money that the organization is going to go up, which of course is good for the organization. So economies of scale sort of explain why the same product can decrease in cost over time. Oftentimes new technology, when it emerges is very expensive. Electric cars are a good example. The first ones were very, very expensive. And although they're still pretty darn expensive, they are coming down in cost. And that's simply because the economies of scale are building up. Economies of scale also explain why there's lots of products that can seem really inexpensive. Take pizza, for example. You can get a pizza for maybe as cheap as $7 or $8 if you have a coupon or something like that. And of course you can pay $15 or $20 or $25 or $30 for a pizza. But that's why products like that can seem fairly inexpensive, and yet the owners of the business continue to make money. They do it because the cost to produce such a product for them is so inexpensive, because they're buying flour in bulk, they're buying the ingredients for tomato sauce in bulk, they're buying pepperoni and cheese and whatever else you sort of want to put on pizza in bulk, and they can spread those costs out over 50 or 100 or 150 or 250 pizzas that they're going to sell in a week or a day, or whatever it is. So economies of scale also explain why some companies merged even though they're competitors, and that was true for Chrysler when they merged with Daimler or whatever it is, um, so on and so forth. It also explains sometimes why healthcare mergers are sometimes happen. They can spread their costs out over um, over a wider array of service providers and sites and things like that. So, in order to maximize, really take advantage of an economy of scale, an organization has to minimize its costs. And so, the organizational economists began looking at different kinds of costs, and they enumerated a few. I don't know that you really need to be too concerned with these. I'm going to talk about sort of what the implications for social work are here in a second. But there were sort of search and information costs, recruiting costs, advertising costs, personnel costs, and enforcement costs. Let me just talk about these each for a second here. So search costs and information costs has to do with researching the market, figuring out what competitors are doing, what competitors' products look like. Recruiting costs has to do with recruiting new customers, new clients, recruiting personnel. Advertising costs has to do with marketing your product, and then personnel costs has to do with how much you pay and compensate people for doing the work. And really, the focus of management, of leaders, of executives, became looking to minimize these costs and inducing people in a way to kind of minimize these costs. So what does all this mean for kind of social work and nonprofits and human services? Well, think back to Mimi Abramovitz, the podcast we listened to, was that the second week, and New Public Management. These emerge, right? These two sort of schools of thought sort of emerged around the same time, approximately the same time. And what organizational economics teaches us is that the administrators and leaders of social work organizations are increasingly, there's a typo there, sorry about that, increasingly trying to reduce costs. What does that mean? How do we reduce costs in human services? Well, we increase caseloads, we shorten appointments, right, so that we can we can get more contact time from people. We discharge clients who miss appointments, right? Because when a client doesn't show up, the organization still has to pay that social worker, right? They still have to pay to keep the lights on. They still have to pay, to put the heat or the air conditioning on. But we discharge clients when they don't show up, so that we keep staff busy, right? We don't have anyone sitting idle. And then we do things called task shifting. And task shifting is decreasing the minimum standard of education required to do certain tasks. Here's an example. Take any old, fictitious sort of counseling mental health agency. Clinical services might be provided by an MSW, but intake might be handled by someone who has a bachelor's degree. In some mental health agencies, MSWs do intakes as well, but in others, it's people with bachelor's degrees. And if the person with a bachelor's degree, who we can pay less because they don't have they haven't traveled as far in their education as someone with the MSW, this frees up time for the MSW to do extra clinical work, or to do more clinical work, which of course would be reimbursed at a higher rate. We see task shifting happening in lots of different places. This is at the bachelor, sort of the BSW level. This has happened when people, organizations sort of move from case management to care management to episode management. We keep sort of reducing the time that we're involved with clients. Of course, this creates lots of problems, and you probably could guess most of these problems without me even talking about them. What this means is that interactions in social work are very transaction focused, right? They're reduced to sort of these binary terms. Did you show up? Yes, no. If you didn't, then then you're discharged. You no longer have the ability to look at why someone isn't showing up for their appointments and sort of get them to the point where they're simply showing up for appointments, right? Um, these challenging social problems, they're just reduced in their complexity, and social workers are good at handling sort of challenging social problems. The emphasis shifts from sort of long-term processes and relationships to sort of short-term outcomes. And of course, it can feel as though our work is devalued. That's highly problematic. So, as I just to conclude here, I think organizational economics and sort of new public management is sort of this confluence, and it sort of explains kind of where we are right now and how social workers are sort of challenged to do kind of less with more. This sort of ongoing focus on outcomes and measurables and deliverables and demonstrable kinds of outcomes. So organizational economics helps us to sort of think about those processes, the reasons why those things are happening. It's all simply a matter of reducing the costs associated with providing care. All right, thank you for watching. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch.